From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake. A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people.
President Trump intensifies his war on the media as the White House bars the New York Times, CNN, the BBC, and others from an off-the-record gaggle while allowing Breitbart and other right-wing organizations in. Now the president's saying he'll skip the White House Correspondents' Dinner. We'll speak with the head of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Then the NAACP calls for a boycott of North Carolina over the state's anti-trans bathroom bill and other policies. We'll speak with the Reverend William Barber.
We today announced the first step of economic engagement. And the first step is that we as an association will not bring our national convention to North Carolina while these abuses continue.
Then we go to Philadelphia, where as many as 500 tombstones have been damaged or overturned in a Jewish cemetery. And we'll look at the results of the race to head the Democratic National Committee. Did Congressman Keith Ellison lose due to his views on Palestine? All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Former Labor Secretary Tom Perez has been elected to lead the Democratic National Committee, beating out Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison, a contentious second-round vote that's seen as determining the future of the Democratic Party. Congressman Ellison is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the first Muslim elected to Congress. He was widely backed by supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party's more progressive wing, and labor unions, including the AFL-CIO, as well as heads of the American Federation of Teachers, National Nurses United, and AFSCME. Perez was backed by the party's establishment, including President Obama. He becomes the first Latino head of the Democratic Party. After Saturday's contentious vote, which marked the first time in more than 30 years the outcome was not known ahead of balloting, Ellison's supporters erupted in protest, chanting, "Party for the people, not big money." Party for the people, not big money. Party for the people, not big money. Perez quickly appointed Ellison deputy party chair, a new position. Standing together, they both urged party unity. This is Tom Perez.
Where do we go from here? Because right now we have to face the facts. We are suffering from a crisis of confidence, a crisis of relevance. We need a chair who can not only take the fight to Donald Trump, make sure that we talk about our positive message of inclusion and opportunity and talk to that big tent of the Democratic Party. We also need a chair who can lead turnaround and change the culture of the Democratic Party and the DNC.
Some critics say Saturday's vote represents the Democratic Party's failure to learn from its left-leaning base and from the party's defeat in the November election. Current Affairs editor Nathan Robinson wrote, "At this point, one has to conclude the National Democratic Party has a death wish," unquote. We'll have more on the DNC vote later in the broadcast. President Trump again escalated his self-declared war on the media while speaking at CPAC. That's the Conservative Political Action Conference Friday.
A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people. Because they have no sources. They just make them up when there are none.
That's Donald Trump speaking at CPAC on Friday, the same day the White House took the unprecedented act of barring the New York Times, CNN, Politico, the Los Angeles Times, the BBC, and several other news organizations from an off-camera briefing known as the Gaggle. Several right-wing news outlets were allowed to attend, including Breitbart, the Washington Times, and One America News Network. Then, the following day, Trump announced he will not attend the White House Correspondents' Association dinner in late April, despite the tradition that presidents attend the black tie affair. The last time a president skipped the dinner was when President Ronald Reagan didn't attend in 1981 because he had been shot in an assassination attempt. On Sunday, White House spokesperson Sarah Huckabee explained Trump's decision to skip the dinner by saying, quote, "One of the things we say in the South is, if a Girl Scout egged your house, would you buy cookies from her? I think that's a pretty similar scenario," she said. In 2011, Trump Trump attended the dinner and was ridiculed by President Obama.
I know that he's taken some flack lately, but no one is happier, no one is prouder to put this birth certificate matter to rest than the Donald. And that's because he can finally get back to focusing on the issues that matter. Like, did we fake the moon landing? What really happened in Roswell? And where are Biggie and Tupac?
That was President Obama ridiculing now President Trump, but it was back in 2011, the White House Correspondents Association dinner. On Sunday, news also surfaced that White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer has attempted to crack down on leaks coming out of the White House by calling an emergency meeting, then forcing his staff to submit to a random phone check to prove they hadn't been leaking information to the press. Spicer also reportedly warned his staff not to leak news of the meeting to the press. But the news did leak to Politico, which broke the story Sunday. We'll have more about the Trump administration and the media after headlines. President Trump is slated to give his first presidential address to Congress Tuesday. Democratic lawmakers have begun giving their tickets away to immigrants as a protest against Trump's crackdown against immigration and immigrants. Among those invited to Trump's address Tuesday is Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, an Iraqi-American doctor who first discovered Flint's children had elevated levels of lead in their blood. President Trump is expected to sign a new executive order banning travel from 7 majority Muslim nations during this week. His first Muslim travel ban was blocked by the courts. Despite Trump's first travel ban suspension, the son of legendary boxer Muhammad Ali was detained for hours by immigration officials at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport February 7th, only a few days after the travel ban was blocked nationwide by Seattle District Judge James Robart. The lawyer for 44-year-old Muhammad Ali Jr. says as he was going through customs on the way back from Jamaica, he was stopped, asked if he was Muslim. Then when he said yes, he was held in question for nearly 2 hours about his religion. Olympic gold medalist, reality TV show star, and Republican Trump supporter Caitlyn Jenner has issued a direct message to President Trump calling the administration's decision to reverse President Obama's landmark decision to order public schools to let transgender students use the bathrooms matching their chosen gender identity a disaster.
Finally, I have a message for President Trump from, one Republican to another. This is a disaster, and you can still fix it. You made a promise to protect the LGBTQ community. Call me.
President Trump's pick to head the Navy, Philip Bilden, is withdrawing his name from consideration, saying he, quote, will not be able to satisfy the Office of Government Ethics requirements without undue disruption and materially adverse divestment of my family's private financial interests, unquote. Bilden is a private equity investor who has amassed a fortune in Hong Kong. He's the third of Trump's cabinet nominees to withdraw in recent weeks, including Labor Secretary nominee Andrew Puzder and Army Secretary nominee Vincent Viola, who also withdrew over concerns about financial scrutiny. The father of Navy SEAL Ryan Owens, who was killed during a botched U.S. military raid in Yemen in January, says he refused to meet with President Trump and is calling for an investigation into his son's death. Bill Owens told the Miami Herald, quote, my conscience wouldn't let me talk to him, unquote. The raid on the Yemeni village left 25 civilians dead, including 9 children under the age of 13. Both he and Trump had gone to Dover Air Force Base. President Trump is expected to tell federal agencies today to create a budget for the upcoming fiscal year that will sharply increase military spending while dramatically cutting spending across domestic agencies. The New York Times reports the budget will include cutting tens of billions of dollars from the Environmental Protection Agency and the State Department. Human Rights Watch is speaking out after the Israeli government rejected a work visa for the organization's Israel and Palestine director, Omar Shakir, claiming Human Rights Watch is engaged in, quote, Palestinian propaganda. This is Shakir.
We received a response on Monday informing us that our request had been denied on the basis that Human Rights Watch was not a real human rights organization, that instead we were engaging in propaganda and falsely raising the banner of human rights.
Back in the United States, more than 100, some say 500 headstones at a Jewish cemetery in Philadelphia were toppled or damaged in the second apparent incident of vandalism of a Jewish cemetery in about a week. Meanwhile, in Florida, a mosque was intentionally set on fire Friday. It's the second time a mosque in Florida has been burned since September. And Moonlight, a coming-of-age film about a young gay black man, won the Oscar for Best Picture at last night's Academy Awards. The win came after Faye Dunaway incorrectly announced La La Land as the winner after she appears to have received the wrong envelope, forcing the awards ceremony officials to come on stage and correct the error.
Guys, I'm sorry. No, there's a mistake. There's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture.
Moonlight won. Come on, this is not a joke. This is not a joke. I'm afraid they read the wrong thing.
Moonlight also garnered a Best Supporting Actor Oscar for Mahershala Ali, who is the first Muslim actor to win an Academy Award. Ali was among a series of black writers and actors who won awards, including Viola Davis, who won Best Supporting Actress for her role in Fences. Overall, last night had more black winners than any previous Academy Awards night. Moonlight also won Best Adapted Screenplay. These are the writers Terrell Alvin, McCraney, and Barry Jenkins accepting the award.
All you people out there who feel like there's no mirror for you, that your life is not reflected, the Academy has your back, the ACLU has your back, we have your back, and for the next 4 years, we will not leave you alone. We will not forget you. Two boys from Liberty City up here on this stage representing 305. This goes out to all those black and brown boys and girls and non-gender conforming who don't see themselves. We're trying to show you, you and us. So thank you, this is for you.
Throughout the awards ceremony, many of the attendees also wore blue ribbons to show their support for the ACLU. The awards ceremony also included other political moments. Emma Stone, who won Best Actress for her role in La La Land, wore a Planned Parenthood pin. Mexican actor Gael Garcia Bernal denounced Trump's border wall while announcing the Oscar for Best Animated Feature Film. White Helmets won the Oscar for Best Documentary Short Subject. In their acceptance speech, the directors read a statement from Raed Saleh, the head of the organization, calling on people to, quote, work on the side of life to stop the bloodshed in Syria and around the world, unquote. Iranian-American astronaut Anousheh Ansari accepted the Oscar for Best Foreign Film on behalf of Iranian director Asghar Farhadi, who boycotted the Oscars over Trump's Muslim travel ban. This is Ansari reading Farhadi's statement.
I'm sorry I'm not with you tonight. My absence is out of respect for the people of my country and those of other 6 nations whom have been disrespected by the inhumane law that bans entry of immigrants to the U.S.
Ahead of the awards ceremony, the directors of the Oscar-nominated foreign language films issued a statement reading, quote, on behalf of all nominees, we would like to express our unanimous and emphatic disapproval of the climate of fanaticism and nationalism we see today in the U.S. and in so many other countries, in parts of the population, and most unfortunately of all, among leading politicians, unquote. O.J. Made in America won for Best Documentary, beating out Ava DuVernay's 13th about mass incarceration and Raoul Peck's I Am Not Your Negro about James Baldwin and other documentaries. And award ceremony host Jimmy Kimmel critiqued President Trump throughout the night, including during his opening statements.
We're at the Oscars, the Academy Awards. You're nominated. You got to come. Your families are nominated. Your friends. Some of you will get to come up here on this stage tonight and give a speech that the President of the United States will tweet about in all caps during his 5 a.m. bowel movement tomorrow. And I think that's pretty darn excellent, if you ask me.
As of now, President Trump has not yet tweeted about the Oscars. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We turn now to look at the Trump administration and press freedom. On Friday, the White House took the unprecedented act of barring the New York Times, CNN, Politico, the Los Angeles Times, the BBC, and several other news organizations from an off-camera briefing known as a gaggle. Meanwhile, several right-wing news outlets were allowed to attend, including Breitbart, the Washington Times, and One America News Network. New York Times editor Dean Baquet said, quote, "Nothing like this has ever happened at the White House in our long history of covering multiple administrations of different parties." Washington Post editor Marty Barron described the White House's decision as appalling, saying the Trump administration is on, quote, an undemocratic path. Interestingly, even White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer spoke out against banning news outlets from press briefings. Well, that was 2 months ago. In December, Spicer said, quote, "We have a respect for the press when it comes to the government. That is something you can't ban an entity from. I think that's what makes democracy a democracy versus a dictatorship," Spicer said in December. Just hours before the New York Times and other outlets were barred from attending the briefing, President Trump spoke at CPAC, that's the Conservative Political Action Conference.
I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake. A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people. Because they have no sources. They just make them up when there are none. There are some great reporters around. They're talented, they're honest as the day is long. They're great. But there are some terrible, dishonest people. And they do a tremendous disservice to our country and to our people, a tremendous disservice. They are very dishonest people, and they shouldn't use sources. They should put the name of the person. You will see stories dry up like you've never seen before.
Donald Trump speaking at CPAC on Friday. Hours later, CNN's Jake Tapper began his show by responding to Trump's actions.
Don't misunderstand what's going on with that rhetoric and with today's action banning various media outlets, including CNN and the New York Times. This White House does not seem to respect the idea of accountability. This White House does not seem to value an independent press. There is a word for that line of thinking. The word is un-American.
CNN's Jake Tapper Friday. Then on Saturday, President Trump announced he would not attend this year's White House Correspondents' Dinner. The last president to skip the dinner was Ronald Reagan in 1981, when he was recovering from an assassination attempt. To talk more about President Trump and press freedom, we're joined by Robert Mani, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Let's start with, President Trump calling the press the enemy of the people.
It's very dangerous. I mean, to vilify the press is to undermine its credibility. The press has a very well-defined role in a democracy, which is to hold office holders and those with power accountable. Here, I think what we're seeing is a deliberate attempt to undermine the press so that in the future, when the press does its job and uncovers something that the administration would like to keep quiet, it'll be dismissed as, it's false news, it's fake. It's very troubling that this should be happening so soon into the presidency.
And this issue that Trump keeps raising of fake news, really, even the term fake news only came into currency toward the end of last year, toward the end of the electoral campaign, and yet he has now appropriated that term as a description of those who criticize him.
Yeah, and we saw in the campaign that he used this, and the campaign is one thing, but now he has the platform of the presidency, which is very, very powerful. And one of the tactics that candidate Trump used was to stick a description onto someone. We had Crooked Hillary or Lying Ted. Now we've got fake news. And
the failing New York Times.
And the failing New York Times. So, for his supporters and for many people, this will stick. And this, as I said, undermines his deliberate attempt to undermine the credibility of the independent press.
On Sunday, the New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet appeared on CNN's Reliable Sources.
I have to say, I think there is an effort by this administration to minimize the press.
Minimize?
To push Yeah, I think that their goal, is to make it so there are a handful of independent institutions whose job it is, and we're among them, to critique the president, to hold the president accountable. The judiciary is in the same batch. And I think if you look at the pattern of the president's tweets, they're actually designed to minimize the institutions who are charged with holding him accountable. And I think that's dangerous.
Your response, Robert?
I think he's right. It is dangerous. And what we have here is a situation where not only is this bad for the U.S. press, it's bad for the press generally around the world, because we look to the United States to act as a champion of press freedom and to stand up for journalists when they get in trouble. If the administration is now dismissing journalists and undermining the value of their work, that's bad news for all those journalists who are physically assaulted elsewhere around the world, not just American journalists now who are being verbally assaulted.
Well, I wanted to ask you, other presidents have had contentious relationships with the press in the past. Richard Nixon, obviously. Bill Clinton, during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, had his difficulties. What do you see that is qualitatively different, if any, about this particular period of conflict now that we've had with Trump?
Well, we're just 4 weeks into the presidency, and already we're having this conversation. There's a big difference. It took a while for Nixon and the press to really get into a situation where they hated one another. We have... It's more extreme, I would say, at this point. And Nixon, other presidents, they hold power. It's natural and it's actually healthy that there is a certain tension between reporters and politicians. If there isn't that tension, then that means that the press isn't doing its job. But this is worse than that. We saw the vilification of the press from a public platform on Friday, and then a few hours later came the barring of these news organizations from a briefing. The way that looks is as if the press is being punished if it's critical and independent.
Let's go to Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, who also attacked the media during his appearance the day before Trump spoke at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference.
If you look at, the opposition party and how they portrayed the campaign, how they portrayed the transition, and now they're portraying the administration, it's always wrong. The mainstream media or opposition party never caught is that if you want to see the Trump agenda, it's very simple. It was all in the speeches. They're corporatist, globalist media that are adamantly opposed to an economic nationalist agenda like Donald Trump has.
So that is Steve Bannon, chief strategist, also former head of Breitbart, which was allowed into the gaggle on Friday.
Yeah. I mean, it's all laid out for you that it's painting the media as the opposition. The media is not the opposition. The press is the fourth estate. It has a very clear role to play in any democracy. By calling it the opposition, again, you are inoculating yourself, I believe, against future criticism. For when things start to go wrong and the press is digging and doing its job, you will be able to dismiss it as biased and politically, affiliated. This sends a very, very dangerous message, and journalists are right to stand up to this at this point and say, we won't accept this. We are not the opposition. We're doing our jobs.
Well, I can see for these threats of course, Bannon said it's going to get worse. It's not even in the future. But this issue of, for instance, excluding some members of the press from what's essentially a small briefing. Clearly, you're making choices all the time, and groups like the New York Times and CNN and Political are used to being considered the first ones to be given these briefings. Is there the same kind of criticism about the exclusion from the gaggle that you would have about these threats to the press directly?
Whether that is repeated or not, I don't know. But you take that, it's sending a message. These were critical outlets. They weren't selected at random, it seemed, and it happened straight after the CPAC criticism. Journalists, not every journalist can get into a briefing. It was a pool. It's a very practical way of sharing information. But everyone that's involved in covering the White House said this was unprecedented. So I believe that it had a purpose beyond just that Sean Spicer didn't have enough room in his office.
I mean, what's interesting about the gaggle, it's off the record. President Trump attacked reporters for using off-the-record sources, saying they should stop doing this. And yet the gaggle required things to be off the record. And that's a criticism of the gaggle, that the White House would often use it over the years to put out perhaps a lie, and then you can't attribute it to anyone. Then you've got the White House Correspondents' Dinner. The press has made an enormous deal out of that. There are a number of journalists who have not gone to it for years because it demonstrates the extremely cozy relationship, Democracy Now! Hasn't gone, between journalists, politicians. They'll often invite politicians as guests or A-list celebrities. But now it's President Trump who won't go, and this is the first time since the attempted assassination of Reagan, when I believe he called in, but he couldn't actually get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, look, you can criticize the relationship between journalists and those in power as being cozy, and Democracy Now! Doesn't go to this dinner, neither does the New York Times for that reason. And as I was saying earlier, it's natural that there is some kind of tension between the press and those in power. But now Trump could have gone to this if he'd wanted to reach out to the press, but he doesn't. So the lines are clearly drawn. This is going to be a very contentious and conflictual kind of relationship.
We'll see if Alec Baldwin will show up in his stead playing Mr. Trump. Robert Mani, we want to thank you for being with us, Deputy Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. When we come back, the NAACP is calling for a ban of North Carolina. We'll go to Raleigh to speak with is calling for a boycott of North Carolina. We'll go to Raleigh to speak with the Reverend Barber. Stay with us. Secondhand News by Fleetwood Mac here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the NAACP has announced it will not hold its convention in North Carolina and urged an international boycott of the state to protest North Carolina's anti-trans bathroom bill and a series of anti-democratic actions taken by the state's Republican legislature. North Carolina's House Bill 2, known as the Bathroom Bill, bars transgender people from using the bathrooms that match their gender identity. The NAACP has also accused Republican legislators of committing voter suppression and racial gerrymandering. This is NAACP President and CEO Cornell William Brooks speaking in North Carolina on Friday.
The NAACP does not take this matter cavalierly. We understand as a consequence of constitutional history that we attempted a boycott in a place called Port Gibson, Mississippi. Right. We were threatened with bankruptcy. We were threatened with bringing our beloved association to its knees. And so for us to contemplate a boycott in the midst of this era of voter suppression is a serious matter indeed. Yes, these folk understand what they're calling for. They're calling for a boycott that will hurt. A boycott that will be painful. A boycott that will literally bring the state to its knees unless it stands up for civil rights. That's right.
We go now to Raleigh, North Carolina, where we're joined by the Reverend Dr. William Barber, president of the North Carolina NAACP, the author of Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement. Dr. Barber, welcome back to Democracy Now! You were standing right next to the NAACP national president as he was speaking. Explain why you're calling for a boycott of your state.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for having us again on Democracy North Carolina. You know, a few weeks ago, we had nearly 100,000 people in the street, and we announced that the state conference of the NAACP, the president, voted unanimously to approach our national requesting permission for a boycott. I'm also a member of the national board. And what we have said, and we had a unanimous resolution that was passed at the state level and unanimously passed at the national board, first saying that we would remove consideration of our national convention coming to North Carolina, as has the NCAA and the ACC, the NBA. And we would call on our other human rights friends, civil rights friends, and conventions to do the same thing. But, Amy, we expanded the narrative, and we said that beyond that, we would form a special task force to explore a full boycott and escalation over the next few months on these lines. Number one, we call on the legislature to repeal undue racially gerrymandered districts and create fair elections that not only have we accused them of, but the courts have ruled that our legislature has passed racialized district. Number two, we want a repeal of the entire HB2 law, because it's not a bathroom law. That bill is an anti-LGBTQ law against transgender people, but it's also an anti-workers bill because it does not allow municipalities to raise a living wage or to have minority set-asides. And it is also an anti-access to state courts for employment discrimination cases. Number three, we want a repeal of SB 4, the law that was passed last December after the extremist laws that strike down the governor's power and no longer allows the governor to have his own appointments, and they tried to change the Board of Election. And lastly, we want a repeal of the law that forces us to go to the appellate court rather than the Supreme Court once our Supreme Court became more progressive in the state. We want to expand the narrative. And we want to say to many of our friends who joined the LGBT community, the transgender community, as we did, that we need to expand the narrative, because if we didn't have voter suppression and if we did not have voter gerrymandering, racialized, unconstitutional voter gerrymandering, many of the people who are elected that passed HB2 would not be in office in the first place.
Well, Reverend Barber, your Republican Governor Pat McCrory has dismissed these protests and the calls for a boycott as basically an action of a left fringe element in your state. Can you respond to that?
Well, that's the only thing they say. You know, I don't use the left-right language. That's the common thing. They lie. You know, Donald Trump wasn't the first one to start lying. McCrory used to call Moral Mondays Money Monday. He says we're left, but 11% of the people that got arrested over 3 years with Moral Mondays were Republicans. He has said that it's a left fringe, but the courts are not a left fringe, and that North Carolina has been found guilty twice on voter suppression. Last August, we won a case that said their so-called voter integrity law was a voter suppression law when they cut early voting, cut same-day registration, denied 17-year-olds the right to pre-register, and tried to pass not just photo ID that the Help America Vote Act allows, but they actually wanted to pass the worst form of photo ID, which said that in this state, even if you had a college ID or a federal ID, it still would not be considered valid. So we know what McCrory and others do. They use that language because they cannot debate us. They have been found guilty time and time again. 14 times this state legislature has passed laws that have been overturned as being unconstitutional. They know that the HB2 law was a scapegoat. They tried to use the transgender community to hide inside of that bill these bills that do not allow a municipality to raise living wages. Right now, a city in North Carolina cannot choose on its own to raise their living wages. They cannot have minority set-asides for African Americans, women and other minorities without going through the legislature. So we know the truth. And while they dismiss us, I think Mr. McCrory has a long-term vacation now. I don't think he's in it longer the governor. And I think that North Carolina was the only state where the coattails of Trump did not trickle down because we had a movement here. We won the governorship. We won the auditor, the Secretary of State. And an African-American in North Carolina won the Supreme Court, won by 350,000 votes, making North Carolina Supreme Court a progressive court for the first time in literally years.
I wanted to ask you about the deal that the state legislature reneged on. I wanted to go to a clip of the new governor, the Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, who said Republicans reneged on a promise to repeal HB 2 last December. Lawmakers failed to overturn the anti-LGBT law, which denies transgender people, of course, the use of the bathroom, changing room, or locker room that matches their gender identity. During a rally in December, protesters chanted "shame, shame" as the lawmakers adjourned from a special one-day session. They had made a deal with the Charlotte City Council, who repealed their LGBT protection legislation in exchange for the legislature repealing HB 2. And yet they adjourned without repealing at the state level. This is Democratic State Representative Equality North Carolina Director Chris Skro.
It is 275 days after this body passed the worst anti-LGBT bill in the entire nation. Every single day, transgender North Carolinians have suffered and been at risk for discrimination and violence, and every single day, our economy has lost millions upon millions of dollars. PayPal is not coming here. Bruce Springsteen's not coming here. Shame! 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 We are going to continue to be sat out as a state because of the image that we are portraying to the rest of the nation and the rest of the world.
So, Reverend Barber, if you can talk about this. I mean, there's enormous economic pressure, and NAACP is bringing that, with the sports teams, with the corporations, over $600 million, it's believed, lost. But this reneging, the deal that was made, that if Charlotte took back, repealed their own pro-LGBT legislation, that the state legislature would repeal HB 2, and they reneged.
Well, this has been the characteristic of this legislature and the former governor. You know, the people in office in our state legislature are unconstitutionally constituted. As I've said, many of them would not be in office except for this racialized gerrymandering. Now, let me back up just a second. We didn't agree with the deal anyway. We didn't think that Charlotte should have to vote the bill down for them to then repeal something that was bad in the first place. Secondly, it is not just the worst LGBTQ bill. It is the worst anti-worker bill and the worst bill that denies access to the courts. I want people to understand the depth of what they did. In North Carolina now, if you have employment discrimination as a heterosexual, as a disabled person, as a veteran, you cannot go to state court because of this law. So they did renege, but we didn't agree on that anyway. We said it shouldn't have ever been a bill and it should have been repealed in the first place. We also are saying to our sports and other people who are right to boycott and not come to the state because of the attack on transgender, we are going to have to, in many of these states, start having economic pressure when they do voter suppression and gerrymander, because that's how the people get in office that are, in fact, passing these laws. Now, that session that they called, Amy, was supposed to be a session to get money to hurricane victims. That's why that session was called. Instead, they refused to repeal HB 2. They then passed Senate Bill 4, taking powers from the governor, denying access to the courts, trying to change our state board of elections so that Republicans could still hold power. And then they did pass a little bit of money for the hurricane victims, which should have been done months earlier. So that whole session was a farce. I just want people to understand that entire session was a farce. And what we know is you cannot trust the current members of our legislature. They're not Republicans. They are extremists. And I want folk to understand 14 times since they've been in office, they have passed laws that have been proven to be unconstitutional.
Reverend Dr. William Barber, president of the North Carolina NAACP, Moral Mondays leader, thanks so much for being with us. We're going to ask if you will stay for the next segment when we talk about the Jewish cemetery in Philadelphia that was just desecrated this weekend, perhaps up to 500 tombstones overturned. We'll be speaking with a local Philadelphia rabbi. And then we're going to look at the election of Tom Perez to head the DNC. Stay with us. Under the cover of darkness. Little Big Town here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We go now to Philadelphia, where hundreds, as many as 500 headstones at a Jewish cemetery were toppled or damaged in the second apparent incident of vandalism at a Jewish cemetery in about a week. On Sunday, in a show of solidarity, members from the local Muslim and Quaker community joined Jewish Philadelphians at the Mount Carmel Cemetery to restore the burial grounds. The apparent vandalism at the Philadelphia and St. Louis cemeteries comes after a surge of bomb threats against Jewish community centers, or JCCs, across the country. The Southern Poverty Law Center and other groups have said hate groups have been energized by the candidacy and then the election of Donald Trump.
On Sunday, the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect put out a statement saying, quote, "Mr. President, it's time for you to deliver a primetime nationally televised speech live from the Oval Office on how you intend to combat not only anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia and other rising forms of hate, whether or not your intention, your presidency, has given the oxygen of incitement to some of the most viciously hateful elements of our society," unquote. Well, for more, we're going to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where we're joined by Rabbi Ari Lev Fornari of Kol Tzedek Synagogue, one of the country's first openly transgender rabbis. Rabbi Ari Lev, welcome to Democracy Now! You went out to the cemetery. Can you describe the scene?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. We arrived midday yesterday around 2 o'clock, and we are pulling up just as some media was pulling up. A small group of rabbis arrived, and as we walked the grounds, there were actually just rows upon rows of desecrated graves. Tombstones actually toppled on each other, often causing the cracking of the tomb and the falling one upon another. And one person in his own sacred witness actually walked the cemetery row by row and counted 539 desecrated graves. One of the most significant moments actually was as we're gathering, figuring out, can we lift these graves? How many people does it take? The manager of the Quaker burial site that shared adjacent to the plot came and kind of showed us how to know what was recent vandalism, showed us how we can tell that this was intent and malice and not just the product of a aggressive storm. And then a Muslim man showed up, Tariq El-Masidi, who runs Celebrate Mercy, and he had a suitcase in his hand. And we said, what brings you here? And he said, I was on my way to the airport, and I heard what happened in my own city, and I canceled my flight and came straight to the cemetery to offer support and solidarity. And that was really the energy of the gathering at the cemetery yesterday, was one of tremendous community support across lines of faith and difference, and a feeling that we will not stand for this kind of hatred. We will not be intimidated. We will gather. And the real sacred resistance in this moment is, hands together in the dirt, really rebuilding and reclaiming our dignity and our integrity as communities of faith and those targeted by this administration.
Is there any indication of who may be responsible, and what's been the response of authorities in Philadelphia?
There's no indication. There was no graffiti. There were no markings. There was just, tremendous, violence against the stones themselves. And in the time that I was there yesterday, for the vast majority of the day, there was no real police presence, although I know the police have been notified, and the manager of the cemetery is also, I think, handling, the path forward and the question of liability and who will be the ones to actually restore and repair the graves. Even just this morning, I got a call from local masons and unions and people who want to help and actually do the physical labor and be part of the restoration.
This cooperation has been amazing, and I wanted to bring Reverend Barber back into this conversation, head of the NAACP of North Carolina, on the desecration of religious sites. Right outside of Houston, in Texas, you had the mosque burned to the ground. The local Jewish synagogue handed the keys over of their synagogue to the Muslim worshipers to say, use our building. You have Empower, the Muslim group led by Linda Sarsour, raising, what was it, over $100,000 when she heard about the Missouri vandalism at the Jewish cemetery for restoring that cemetery. Reverend Barber, what about these attacks, and what about what the Anne Frank Center said? Whether President Trump is actively encouraging this, he's got to make a national statement against this. I don't think he's tweeted about this recent cemetery attack. It took a long time on the Missouri one. He finally spoke at the African American Museum in Washington, reading a statement after tremendous outcry from folks of all different religious persuasions.
Yes, and Linda Sarsour is one of my good friends, and just a few weeks ago, as I said, we had thousands of people in the street. We were marching together, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Sikh. We have to hold one another together. One of the actors said last night, we have to exhume the stories of people that have died. And what that means is we have to call to memory people like Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King and others, and Gandhi, who will remind us of how ugly hate and violence is. Hate and violence poisons the whole system. And our president has been a polluter. He's been a poisoner of the system. Whether it was the hate that was embedded in his birtherism claims, the hate that he has shown toward Mexicans in naming them rapists and criminals, the hate he has shown toward Muslims and refugees. But it's not just President Trump. All of those who said nothing when he was pushing his birtherism hate, when he was pushing his Mexican hate, those like Ryan who called his policies classic racism, but then turn around and support a person that you just said is a racist. And so we've seen it in so many ways. And then in addition to that, and we're seeing this violent political, violent policies. Coretta Scott King once talked about denying people health care was a form of violence. And what are we seeing today? We're seeing this attack on the poor, attack on immigrants. We're seeing attack on people that need health care. It's been attack. And what our president has done, President Trump has done, is he spent more time tweeting and hurting and denying and lying and spreading hate than he has spent standing up and being a statesman, and not only making statements, because even at the African American Museum, he was there and he said that the museum could heal our divisions, not changing policies. He was at the museum talking about healing while his administration is lying about voter suppression and lying about voter fraud and not restoring the Voting Rights Act. So we're in a season of hate and a season of political violence. And we who believe in love and justice must challenge it and must challenge him as well as all others who are standing on the sidelines and allowing these things to happen without a word and certainly without the works of love and justice.
I wanted to ask Rabbi Ari Lev Fornari, President Trump did make a statement last week against anti-Semitism. What was your reaction to that statement? And what do you feel, if anything, is his responsibility as we're seeing this increase in attacks, anti-Semitic attacks around the country?
Yeah, certainly we see this rise as part of, in this case, the tactic of the state and seemingly the agenda of this administration to intimidate and fear. And the appointment of Jeff Sessions and Bannon make it clear that whether or not he makes a statement, his words and his actions are incongruent with one another. And it's our responsibility to create a sense of collective safety and support each other and show up for each other. And in the spirit of Heschel, as Reverend Barber was saying, real prayer is the overturning of the callousness of hatred and oppression and injustice anywhere, and that's what this will be. Our rising against this administration and against those who have been emboldened to act out of white supremacy. We will rise against it, and our prayer will be to overturn that and to come together and build greater relationships and greater coalitions for real justice in this country.
Has the Trump immigration crackdown led any synagogues to become sanctuary synagogues, Rabbi Fornari?
Yeah, in fact, actually, Kol Tzedek Synagogue in West Philadelphia joined the new sanctuary movement here in Philadelphia. And it's my understanding that 4 other synagogues in the last several months have joined the new sanctuary movement. And we have an organizing body, and over 500 people in Philadelphia have been trained in their new campaign, Sanctuary in the Streets, and including dozens of my own congregants here in Philadelphia. And we've unfortunately had the opportunity to offer rapid response and witness in solidarity and figure out ways that we can mobilize in support of immigrant communities of which we are a part, of which there's members in our own community. We have a large multi-faith community, many members in interfaith relationships. So the Muslim community is directly part of our community, and immigrant communities are directly part of our community, and we stand with them in solidarity and also as them.
Very quickly, finally, when asked about anti-Semitism, when he cuts off questions at news conferences, he often refers to his family, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and, of course, his daughter, Ivanka, who converted to Judaism when she married Jared Kushner. Your response when he says you can't get someone less anti-Semitic than me?
The term anti-Semitism has been exploited for all sorts of imperialist projects. And when I hear that, I feel a lot of shame and disgrace for the way they're standing and in that Judaism. And I believe that Judaism is committed to the liberation of all people and as a spiritual practice that is meant to, open our hearts and increase compassion and justice in this world. And we all claim our own spiritual practice and our own spiritual traditions, and I claim it very differently than Jared Kushner does. And I stand in opposition to this administration and to the ways that it may exploit Judaism for its own purposes.
We want to thank you for joining us, Rabbi Ari Lev Fornari of the Kol Tzedek Synagogue in West Philadelphia. Also to Reverend William Barber at the NAACP, North Carolina. This is Democracy Now! As we turn now to a major story that broke this weekend. Juan?
Well, former Labor Secretary Tom Perez has been elected to lead the Democratic National Committee, beating out Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison in a contentious second-round vote that is seen as determining the future of the Democratic Party. Congressman Ellison is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the first Muslim elected to Congress. He was widely backed by supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party's more progressive wing. Perez was backed by the party's establishment, including President Obama. He becomes the first Latino head of the Democratic Party. After Saturday's vote, which marked the first time in more than 30 years that the outcome was not known ahead of the balloting, Ellison supporters erupted in protest, chanting, "Party for the people, not big money."
Tom Perez quickly appointed Ellison deputy party chair, which was a new position. Standing together, they both urged party unity. This is Tom Perez.
Where do we go from here? Because right now we have to face the facts. We are suffering from a crisis of confidence, a crisis of relevance. We need a chair who can not only take the fight to Donald Trump, make sure that we talk about our positive message of inclusion and opportunity and talk to that big tent of the Democratic Party. We also need a chair who can lead turnaround and change the culture of the Democratic Party and the DNC.
We go now to Washington, where we're joined by Zed Jelani, staff reporter at The Intercept. His latest article, Keith Ellison loses DNC race after heated campaign targeting him for his views on Palestine. So explain, Zed.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Keith Ellison started out very strong in this race. He received endorsements not only from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, but also from Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer, from a wide variety of labor unions. I mean, in a way, he really was the unity candidate in that he had brought together Sanders backers and Clinton backers. But as the campaign developed, we started to see more and more negative hits pop up in the media. We saw one of the largest donors of the Democratic Party, entertainment tycoon Haim Saban, who's an Israeli-American businessman, come out and say that he's an anti-Semite, say that he's anti-Israel. The Anti-Defamation League called on Keith Ellison to be disqualified. The night before the vote, delegates were getting emails from the American Jewish Congress saying that, Keith will be really bad for the U.S.-Israel relationship and that he shouldn't be confirmed. There was a widespread sort of smear campaign targeting Keith Ellison for his view about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is actually quite moderate. He believes in a secure Israel. He's voted for aid to Israel most of the time. But he also believes in rights for Palestinians. He opposes the blockade on Gaza. He opposes the settlement construction. And he's been vocal about that, and he's talked to both sides, and he's been very close to both the American Jewish community and the American Muslim community. But unfortunately, there are a number of big donors to the Democratic Party who feel like moderation isn't really what they need, that what we need is a relationship between Israel where we have absolutely no daylight. And this is all coming despite the fact that the DNC chairman actually has no role whatsoever in setting Middle East policy. And yet we still saw this campaign of innuendo and smears come out against Ellison.
And said the particular role of President Obama and his main staff on this vote?
Well, it's really interesting. The night before and also the day of, we saw President Obama, his close aide, this is Valerie Jarrett, making phone calls on behalf of Tom Perez, which is really interesting because what we saw here was that there were forces close to Obama and close to Clinton moving in at the last moment when it appeared that Keith might be successful to reassert their control over the party. Now, you have to remember that one of Keith's big sort of reasons for running for this position is because he wanted to sever the link between big money and the operation of the Democratic Party. And, of course, a lot of these members themselves are consultants, they're lobbyists. One of the men who nominated Tom Perez during the convention is actually a corporate lobbyist for the Podesta Group. He worked for Clean Coal. He worked so-called Clean Coal. He worked for General Dynamics. I mean, this was literally a lobbyist that was going around whipping votes for Tom Perez. So I think what we saw here was that the party asserted itself against a rising candidate to try to maintain control and to keep power away from the grassroots.
After Tom Perez was elected chair of the DNC, Donald Trump tweeted, "The race for DNC chairman was, of course, totally rigged. Bernie's guy, like Bernie himself, never had a chance. Clinton demanded Perez." That's what Trump tweeted. Bernie Sanders appeared on CNN's State of the Union Sunday. Host Jake Tapper asked Sanders if he thought Trump had a point.
No, he doesn't have a point. That's what the system is. And one of the things that Tom is going to have to change is to figure out how we elect national Democratic leaders. I'm not quite impressed with the process that now exists.
Tapper also asked Senator Sanders if he'd be handing over his, 2 million or so member list to the DNC. He did not say he would. Zed Jelani, your response.
Well, it's really interesting. Right before Keith Ellison was actually defeated, the DNC actually voted on a resolution that would have barred corporate lobbyists and also corporate donations to the DNC, and that resolution was voted down. And actually, a lot of the very same arguments that were used at the DNC were used at the RNC over the summer when a few reformist Republicans tried to put up a similar resolution. They said, hey, you'll be banning farmers and pastors and people who represent domestic violence, clinics. All these things are complete nonsense, of course. But I think what you saw was both parties have an addiction to an establishment and to people who have a rooted sort of sense of power and a sense of privilege, and they're refusing to sort of turn over power to the grassroots. So when the Democrats asked for Bernie Sanders' email list, I mean, it's not like, Cory Booker can use that list and someone who gave $10 to Bernie Sanders is going to be enthusiastic about giving money to someone who votes with big pharmaceuticals, or someone who votes with Wall Street, or someone who helped smear Keith Ellison for his very moderate views on Israel-Palestine. I mean, I don't think that list is a magic tool for the Democratic Party. If they want small donors like that giving to them, then they should sever the link to the big donors. No one's going to be, no one who's poor or working class is going to give you money, and they feel like their money isn't going to influence
we
just
have
the big
5
donors
seconds.
are.
The significance of Ellison being made the deputy co-chair of the DNC, a new position.
Well, it's not a position in the bylaws. It seems like sort of an advisory role, but it's probably positive that he'll be staying in Congress now.
I want to thank you for being with us. Zed Jelani of The Intercept will link to your piece. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Democracy Now! Produced by a remarkable group of people. Mike Burke, Noreen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Dina Geisler. Thanks for joining us.